Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Miller Talk podcast. I'm your host, Austin, and today I'm going to be talking about my time working at the Great Plains Correctional Facility and the riot that happened there. First, I would like to give a shout out to Chris from the Just Between Us podcast. You can find him at JBU_show and at militia_project on X, and Just Between Us on Spotify and anchor.fm/JBU. I was recently invited on his show to give my perspective on the Iran/Israel conflict and my feelings towards the bombing of the nuclear sites in Iran. And with that, let's get into it. So in 2016, I began working at the Great Plains Correctional Facility. With that, I began my time as a correctional officer. I began working there because I wanted to become a police officer, and I thought it was a good way for me to get experience doing that before I was old enough to become a police officer, because you had to be 21 years old to go through all those courses and everything that you have to do. So I began working there, and I found it to be a pretty cool job. It was very laid back in the beginning. This facility had around 1,900 inmates with a full capacity of around 2,100, but we never quite hit that. There was a main facility, and inside that facility was the cafeteria. There was three different, what would you call those? I'm so sorry. There's three housing units, yes, within that building that were all attached to the cafeteria. And then there was the central control, and there was a barber shop, the dang it, maybe I should have been more prepared. The commissary shop, and this is where all of the administration buildings were held. This is where the warden's office was and the major's office. And I guess just to explain quickly how the leadership worked there, you had the warden, then one major under him, and then we had about 6 lieutenants under that and 2 sergeants. One was a day sergeant, one was an overnight sergeant. And the warden and the major obviously only worked days. And then we had the administration that everyone that worked there was technically a correctional officer, even if they worked in the cafeteria, or if they worked in the, the kitchen, which also the kitchen was inside this facility, in the main facility. And then the administration building. And so if you're looking at it head on, you will be facing west. So if you walked into the building, the first thing you walk into is the lobby area, and this is where all the check-ins happen. And then directly attached to that lobby area is the visitation center, which is a part of the main building, obviously. And then you would go through the door, and behind a wall of the lobby where you checked in, and you basically went through a whole screening process every time you came in to check for contraband and all of that. So you would go through a door to your right, and then there would be a hallway that was a sally port. So that means it had you could only come in through one door, and then that door had to be shut and locked before you could go through the next door. But there was a door that went into the administration part on your right, where you could go straight through into the main facility. And then there was a door on your left that would go into central control. This is where everything was housed. This is where our weapons, and the only weapons that we had were batons and paintball guns with pepper balls and CS gas pepper spray. And that is where the entire facility was controlled. They every single housing unit had its own central control, but this was the main central control. So within the housing unit central control, that's how they opened the doors to the cells. That's how they opened doors into the housing unit, because every housing unit had its own door that opened and closed. And just to mention quickly, this was a low medium facility. So the way that prisons work, or prisons, jails, all that, they work off of a security system, and it ranks from low to maximum security. So it goes low, low, medium, 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 high, high, maximum. So we were on the lower end. And this prison was privately owned by GEO, but it housed federal inmates. And all these inmates were illegal immigrants. So back to what I was talking about, you had the central control, and the central control can control every single door in the facility. So it can override the housing unit's central controls to open doors if it ever needed to. And that's obvious, like I said, that's where our weapons were housed and everything. It is supposed to be almost impossible for an inmate to get into here. So continuing on with the tour of the facility. So you're still facing west as you walk in. And if you go south, you will head towards the cafeteria and a long hallway that has the cafeteria on the east side, and eventually you'll come along a door on the west side that goes out into the open part of the facility. So we'll come back to that. So you keep going down this west side and you'll come up to Charlie Housing Unit. And this is, they called it the geriatric one. This is where all of the older inmates were housed. And so this facility was, like I said, illegal immigrants. So 90% Mexican. But there were some Canadians in there, not very many. And there were people from Africa in, different types of countries there. And then there was people from the Middle East there. And there's even some people from Europe. And of course, these people came here because they were running away from crimes that they committed in those other countries, which is the main reason why someone would come here illegally. So you go into Charlie facility, and if I remember correctly, Charlie facility, or Charlie housing unit, had about 100 different cells, and they were only 2-man cells. And then it had a large day area. It was the largest housing unit that was inside the main facility, and it had 2 tiers. So now we come back out, and if you were to head north down that long hallway, just past the main entrance door on the west side of this hallway, you would find Bravo, the Bravo housing unit. And inside there is where all the black inmates were held. And I know a lot of people like to say that we ended segregation a long time ago, but it is still alive and well inside the prisons. And so you would go into there, and it was like a round one, and there was only, I believe there was only 6 separate day rooms, and 2 of them were actually connected, and that was the SHU, or the segregated housing unit. This is where inmates that broke rules inside the prison went to serve their punishment if it was bad enough. You know, if they got into fights or they were found with contraband or any type of weapons. So contraband would be like cigarettes, any type of tobacco, drugs, and the biggest one, cell phones. So the SHU had its own um, officers that worked in there. And when you worked in there, you had to do rounds every 30 minutes. And they were documented. And inside every central control of every housing unit, there was a main office, and then you would go upstairs to the central control. And inside that main office is where the officers were. And inside there was usually just a desk with the logbook in it. And if you're in the military, you're probably familiar with logbooks, or if you've worked in corrections before, you're probably familiar with logbooks. But the thing with that is in the SHU, it was basically it was almost its own separate facility, besides still being controlled by the Bravo unit, central control. But when you went into there, every single inmate in there was only allowed out 2 hours a day. 1 hour was for showering, and the other hour was for recreational time, which we then took them to a cage, and there was some basketballs in there, and that's the only time they really got to see other inmates, was through that cage. And also inside the Bravo unit, they were 2-man cells, but most of the time the SHU was pretty much solitary confinement. It was rare that the SHU would get so full that they would have to double up inmates. But so there was 6 separate day rooms, but 2 were combined, so technically 5 to make the SHU. And there was only about 10 or 12 cells, if I'm remembering correctly, inside those. And so that's the Bravo unit. And so now we're going to come back out of the Bravo unit, and we're going to head further north down the hallway. And on your east side, you'll run into the commissary and the barbershop. And then if you keep heading north, you'll run into Alpha Unit. So my time at the correctional facility, I only worked in Bravo Unit once. I never worked in the SHU, but I never worked Alpha or Charlie. So when you go into Alpha Unit, it's basically the same as Bravo, but there's no SHU in it. So it's 6 separate day rooms with about 10 or 12 cells, and they all hold 2 inmates each. So now that we've gone there, we can head back south, and before you get back to the central control and the door that leads out of the prison, you can head east down a hallway, and then it'll curve back up north, and this is where the cafeteria was, this is where laundry was. And if you headed north down that hallway long enough, you would run into a door that went out to the shipping and receiving dock, and that's also where the trash compactor was. And and then you head out that door, and there's a building, and inside that building was the officer's break room. And it had normal break room stuff, vending machines and stuff. Inmates weren't allowed in there, but if you came out of that break room and walked around the building, that's where the inmates were processed in and out. So in there was 3 cells and another door that led back outside to what we called the rear gate. It technically wasn't in the rear of the facility. It was technically like right up in front. But that was a sally port where the gate would open and you would have to close it And then they would fully inspect any vehicles coming in there. If they're delivering food, or if it's buses bringing in inmates, or, sometimes inmates had to leave the facility to get surgeries or other medical um, treatments that we couldn't do inside the facility. So they would leave in a prison van. And so they would fully inspect these inside and out, obviously, to make sure there's no contraband, no bombs, anything like that. And then once that was done, the other gate would open up and they could drive into processing. So now we're gonna come back out and we're gonna go back to the central control door. And you're gonna head south down the hallway to that door I said earlier that you needed to remember. That goes outside to the rec yards, and then there's 2 more buildings out there called Echo Unit and Delta Unit. These are the units that I worked in a majority of the time. And so you go out there and you're heading west, and it's basically like a hallway, but there's just fences around you instead of brick walls. And if you keep heading west for not too long, on your north side will be the Delta Unit. So if we go into the Delta Unit, it was a very long hallway, and eventually you came into the rotunda, and there was 8 separate day rooms. And then if you walked straight in and you looked forward, that's where the officer's office was. And just like the other offices, it was basically just a desk, and that's where we held the toilet paper and things like that. And then next to the door that goes in the office is the door that goes upstairs into the central control of Delta Unit. So each day room had 10 cells in it, and these were 8-man cells. So basically, besides Charlie Unit being specifically for the older population and the sicker guys that needed medication often, and then the Bravo Unit was only for Black people. The other ones were kind of mixed. I believe Alpha Unit held the Saturnios. So inside this prison, like I mentioned, it was all illegal immigrants and 90% Latinos. And it was a male facility. I don't know if I mentioned that yet. So within the Latino group, there was the Norteños, the Sotoños, which just means north and south in Spanish, and then the Paisas. And we had a couple MS-13 and a couple other random gangs. But the main gangs were Paisas and Norteños. There was a small amount of Sotoños, a very small amount of MS-13, because this was a low-medium facility. So MS-13, as most of you should know now, is a very dangerous gang. But a lot of these guys were in there just on immigration charges and drug charges. Some of them were in there because if you know how the prison system works, a lot of times if you end up getting held at a higher facility, like even a medium or a high security facility, and say you have to do 8 or 10 years, sometimes for the last year or two, they'll move you down to a medium or a low medium like this one was. So, and I guess I didn't explain, in a low medium, the inmates can move fairly freely without much supervision of the officers. But there was only 3 fences that were 20 feet high, and in between those fences was razor wire, and on the top was razor and barbed wire. So that's the difference between like a medium or a high. They'll have less mobility, less freedom. I mean, they're in prison, so more freedom means a lot. And there'll usually be higher fences or more fences. So back to Delta, um, there's 8 day rooms, and they all hold 8 inmates each and 10 per. Now, for some reason, um, the Delta building never was really full. And like I said, we only at max held 1,900 inmates, but the facility could technically hold 2,100. So the C unit was rarely like full to the max, but A and B were usually full. Besides the shoe, like I mentioned, that was only to punish people for their longer times, and also like if inmates had threats against them, because the other inmates, if the other inmates found out that one inmate was a pedophile, they immediately got sent to the shoe until they could be processed to send to another facility where they could wait out their time until the inmates found out again that they were a pedophile and they get moved to a different facility. And that's common within, if they didn't get beat up or killed before. But luckily in this facility, it was very lowbrow. We didn't have much contraband. I myself never found drugs. And we found very small amounts of weapons. I found one weapon once, but majority of the contraband we'd find is just cell phones. So the Delta facility was very underpopulated. And the way it would work is if you're in that rotunda and you're looking at the 8 different day rooms that are in there, there's 4 on each side of the central control. And they all house 8 inmates per 10 cells, so 80 inmates each. And if you're looking at it on your right, it would be Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Golf, on and on. And so if I was an officer working in the Delta unit and I needed to get into the Alpha day room, I would get out my radio and I would call Delta Central Control. This is Officer Miller. I need Delta Alpha day room door open. And then they would buzz the door, you would walk in, close it behind you. And it was a 2-tiered facility. So, and each day room was connected with a door that could only be open with keys. And the only way you could get these keys is by going to Central Control, and you would have to get out the emergency keys, or what they called the OIC keys, which just means officer in charge. So on the day shift, there was a specific officer for every housing unit that was the officer in charge. And they only worked the day shift, and they got the Monday through Friday schedule. I never got to be the OIC. It was chosen by, I think the lieutenants got together and they would choose it. And once you were appointed to this, the only way a new officer in charge was chosen was either every couple of months they would go in there and ask and see if they wanted to change the officer in charge. And of course, the SHU, we have to remember, is basically its own thing, so there'd be an officer in charge of the SHU. But most of the time, that was actually just one of the sergeants. And they would go in there and they would choose if they wanted to keep him as officer in charge, if they were doing a good job. It was just a label. It didn't come with a pay raise. Really, the only thing it came with was getting the Monday through Friday schedule, and a position that you're technically the supervisor, unless the sergeant's there, and then he's the supervisor, and then if a lieutenant's there or the major, it's a command thing. So the officer in charge would be the one that has to fill out the logbook, and they're the one that's solely responsible for everything going on inside the specific building. But so each of these um, day rooms, they're connected by a door, and the only way you can get through those doors is with the officer in charge is keys or the emergency keys. And the emergency keys had special keys on them that go to those doors. They also go to the there's an emergency hatch inside the central control where you can get on the roof of the buildings. So the only way you can get those keys is by going to central control and checking them out. And the way you did that is we had a chit system. And basically what that is it was just a gold circle and it would have your initials stamped on it. So you would go into central control and you would take one of your chits off and you would put it in the little slot and you would tell them, I need, you could use chits to check out. You had to use chits to check out things like handcuffs, radios, which everyone had to have a radio, but the optional things were handcuffs and then you had to check out keys. Everyone had to have a basic set of keys on them in case the power went out, and they would just go to the normal doors. And the emergency keys went to the extra doors that connected the day rooms and to the emergency hatch and doors that led to the outside part of the facility. So you could check out those things. I almost always carried handcuffs with me. Most officers wouldn't, except for the sergeants, lieutenants, and the major and the warden always had handcuffs on them. But I was one of the few officers that took as many precautions as I could. And I think most of my viewers, if you're a normal viewer, I think you know probably why I would do that. I'm very into self-defense, So that's about the layout of the Delta facility. And so if we come back out of the Delta facility, you'd be facing south. So to your east is the Alpha Bravo yard. And the reason why they call it the Alpha Bravo yard was it was a recreational yard. And the only reason why they call it that is because it was directly connected to the Alpha and Bravo building. Nothing special about the naming. That's just a technical way of naming it. And on that yard was just a soccer field. Not much going on there. It was a smaller yard. So if we look back now to the south, we can go back to that long hallway I talked about. And you can keep heading further west. And if you go probably 20 yards, 25 yards west, on the south side will be the Echo and Delta yard. And as I explained, the Alpha and Bravo yard, it's called the Echo Delta yard because it's connected to the Echo and Delta buildings. So the Echo Delta yard was the nice, fancy yard. That's the yard pretty much everyone wanted to go to. But we were only supposed to have around, I think it was 200 to 400 inmates on the yard at one time. And during recreational times, there had to be one officer on the yard with the inmates. So if you can imagine, that's kind of a 1 to 400 ratio. And if you got assigned to rec service, basically all you did the entire time was what most of the inmates did, was you walked around the track because you had to, constantly be looking for things going on. But so on the Echo Delta yard, there was a soccer field too, but there was also a basketball court and a pickleball court. But the inmates weren't allowed to have anything like a racket or anything. And then there was a covered area where there was small amounts of weights that inmates could use to lift. But that was about it. And, there's a walking track, like I said, around all of this. So in the center of that is basketball court, pickleball court, but they couldn't have rackets, so they mostly just played handball. It's the same thing, but with their hands instead of a racket. And the soccer field were all in the middle of this walking track, and it was a fairly large yard. I want to say that that walking path, which some people ran on, you know how it is. I want to say it was a mile and a half, so it was fairly big. And if you got assigned rec duty, basically all you would do is walk around that and look at stuff. And but like I said, most of the time, this was a medium low facility, so there wasn't a lot going on. So if we come back out of that yard and you'll turn to the east, or no, you'll turn to the north, and then you can keep going west again. And at the very end of this long hallway, there's the Echo building. And it is an exact replica copy of the Delta building, so no need to explain that. So I spent most of my time as an officer working in the Echo and Delta facility. And in that time, I built up a great rapport with the inmates. Most of the inmates knew who I was, and they liked it when I came on. When I first started, I was working in the Echo facility, and I was working the Echo building, and I was working the evening shift. And that was, I believe it started at 6 p.m. No, let's see. So the day shift started at 6 a.m. and it was an 8-hour shift. There was 3 shifts. So 6 a.m. Actually, I think it started around 3 p.m. and then you would end at 11. So it was kind of a weird shift, but that's where most of the officers started when they were doing their on-the-job training. And then after you got through your first month or two, or every 3 months, is when shift change happened. Not a great thing, because most people, it takes them right around 3 months to get used to a shift, and that's just like a psychological thing. So every 3 months you would get changed, and they would put up a sheet, and you had no say in it. They could move you to whatever building, whatever role, and whatever shift. So I started out on the evening shift in the Echo building, and I built a pretty good rapport with the inmates at first, because a lot of officers come in there and they want to be big and bad and in charge and show these inmates what they're all about. And I was never about that. I realized, like, even as a young adult, I never really liked illegal immigrants and stuff. It was never something that I was okay with, but I still realized these people are humans, and I treated them as such. So that immediately gained me a great amount of respect from these inmates, because all the new officers would usually come in and try to boss them around and, hey, inmate, and not learn their names and stuff like that. But I learned these guys' names, which, if I'm going to be funny here and kind of be, it was pretty easy. It, like, Rojas and Hernandez and De La Torres, these were all common, like fairly common names. So it wasn't hard to really remember them. But I built up a great friendship, and really not supposed to be friends with the inmates, but a professional friendship with these inmates. And I got to know the orderlies that worked there. And so orderlies are inmates who clean the facility. And so you have the orderlies for the entire facility, you have orderlies for the cafeteria, and then you have orderlies that live inside a building and they clean that building. So I got to know these orderlies fairly well. And they would come in and do their job, and we would talk and stuff. And what I got to know quickly is that these inmates were, they would always have about the same story. They would say that they were picked up because of conspiracy charges. They weren't supposed to be here. Um, they had their green cards revoked. They had their immigration statuses revoked because of conspiracy to commit crimes. But inside the administrative part of the facility, you could go in and every single inmate's file was kept on hand. So as long as you had their DOJ number, you could go in there and there'd be like books and you could open them up and find their number and you could see their entire rap sheet of what they did. A majority of these inmates, like I said, they were held for illegal immigration. And then on top of that, a majority of them were held for what is it? Um, why did I blank? They're held for illegal immigration, which is for your first offense is a 6-month sentence. And then your second offense is a year. And your third offense is 2 years. And after they serve their time, they would get deported. And a majority of them would say that they were just in there because of this and that, and it was conspiracy, and they didn't actually commit anything, and they're not supposed to be in there. And most of it was intent to distribute. So they were caught with enough drugs that it wasn't for personal use. So you're not talking about like getting caught with an ounce of weed or an 8-ball of coke. You're talking about getting caught with pounds of weed, pounds of cocaine, or kilos, you'd probably call it. And that is how you get an intent to distribute charge. And so most of them were in there for probably 6 months to a year, which would be 4 to 8 months with good time or good behavior. And so I got to know these guys and they would tell me their stories. And one of the guys, I'm just going to keep his name, anonymous, but we'll just call him Rojas, like I said. They were almost all Rojas, De La Torres, Hernandez, stuff like that. But Rojas told me that he came here legally, he got his green card, he got married, he had 2 kids, and then one of his old friends from Mexico called him and said that he found a car he wanted to buy in Kansas. And he just wanted him to take this car down to the Mexico border. And from there, he would pay him a small fee for doing that for him. And since he wasn't legally allowed in America, he could then take it from the Mexico border and, do whatever he wanted to do. But what happened was he was driving through Texas. He got pulled over for speeding. And then they searched the car and they ended up finding 2 kilos of cocaine in this car. So it was not just him buying a car in America and wanting it to be driven to Mexico. So that's how he got picked up and sent to jail. And this guy was pretty cool. I'll say he was a nice guy. He did good work. He always cleaned the office for me. And then he always had these stories to tell. But so moving on, my other orderly that was a very good worker, we'll call him Hernandez. He was a funny guy. He always had jokes to tell. So I'm going to tell one of his funniest jokes here that I still tell today because he told it to me and I've repeated it ever since. But I give the credit to him. It goes like this. So there was this gay guy, and it's supposed, okay, so I have to start off. It's supposed to be told in Spanish, so it still works out in English, but just so you know, it's supposed to be told in Spanish, so it makes more sense if you tell it in Spanish. So, anyways, there's this gay guy, and he hadn't come out as gay yet, but he wanted to. And so he wanted to have his first sexual experience. But of course, he was a bottom, and he didn't want a well endowed man to be his first time because it's his first time. So he didn't want to get hurt. So he goes to this gay bar, and he kind of sits around for a while and has a couple of drinks, and he's looking around, but he's shy. He hasn't gone on a date with anyone before, and he especially hasn't had any sexual encounters before. So for a while, he realizes he can't really muster up the ability to talk to anyone to try and get this encounter to happen. And so he comes up with this idea. He's going to go to the bathroom and he's going to stand at the urinals. And when other men come up to pee, he's going to look over the dividers and, see their member. And so he's standing there acting like he's peeing. People are coming up and they're peeing, and he's looking over and he's like, no, that guy's way too big. And another guy comes up and he's like, still way too big, but I'd like someone smaller. And he's looking over, no. And then eventually he looks over and this guy has a small one. And tattooed on this small one is Chico, which means like little boy or small in Spanish. And so he said, oh, this is the one. So he finishes up what he's doing. He goes out and he starts talking to this guy, and they have a couple of drinks. And eventually they go back to his place. And everything gets hot and heavy, and eventually they get to doing the deed. And so he gets down on his hands and knees and prepares himself for this first time. And then all of a sudden he screams, ah! And he looks back, and tattooed on this guy's member is Chicago, Illinois. That was the funniest joke I had heard at the time. But he was a very good orderly too. He always did anything I asked when I asked it. And inside the prison, they're not allowed to have money. So their currency is usually commissary or stamps that they would use to mail letters, or toilet paper, literally just toilet paper. And so inside of my office, it wasn't just my office, but you know what I mean. Inside the office is where we held the toilet paper. And once a month, we would get a full shipment in, and it would literally be like 5 thick, and I want to say 6 or 8 high things of like Costco sized toilet paper. And it wasn't good toilet paper. Obviously, the prison wasn't spending good money for these guys to wipe their butts. But he would, Hernandez there, would always try to take an extra thing of toilet paper so he could use it for gambling, which wasn't allowed, but usually kind of looked the other way because it's kind of hard to prove if they were just playing cards or if they were gambling. But you'd always try to take it so he could use it as currency. And I have to tell him no. Like, I was firm, and like I said, I had a very professional friendship with these guys, so I always tell him no. But every once in a while, if he did something that I asked, I'm an officer, and hey, I don't want to do this. It's supposed to be something I do, but do you want to go do it? And I'd give him an extra thing of toilet paper. But after he told me that joke, I gave him 2 rolls because it was funny. And every inmate was supposed to get 2 rolls per week. Doesn't really matter, but just thought I'd mention it. And so those were my 2 orderlies that I knew well in the Echo building. And I worked there for about a year. And I got to know the inmates fairly well, and the inmates respected me because to a lot of officers, this was just a job and they didn't really care. But I always cared because I knew these guys were humans. And as much as I didn't like what they did, and I don't like illegal immigration to this day, I still treated them like humans. And so a lot of officers would not file their requests. So inmates would get requests that they could file, different types, just grievances, grievances against officers, medical grievances, things like that. And the only way they could get filed was if an officer filed it for them. So they would get the paper and they would fill it out, and then you, the officer, have to take it to actually get filed. Well, all these officers are just like stuff them in the desk, and I was always like, dude, like, can you not do this one simple thing for them? Sorry. So I was just one of those officers that would actually get them filed. And even if they were a grievance against me, because sometimes you have to go and search inmate cells. We had a quota of how many cells had to be searched per shift per month. And so you're supposed to do them sporadically, but obviously lazier officers wouldn't get them done. And so sometimes it would come towards the end of the month and you have to do 5 cell searches. And so normally when you go doing a cell search, you just go in there, you lift up the beds, you check the walls, make sure they're not making holes in them to store contraband, and every inmate had a plastic tub that they would store their personal stuff in. And of course, this is an 8-man cell, so there's 4 bunks on each side, and there was an underside to it where they could store stuff, and there's a toilet in there, and a water fountain so they can brush their teeth and get water. And there's also water fountains outside of there, in the day rooms. And in the day rooms, there were 4 TVs, and the inmates couldn't control them, but we had the remote controls and we could change the channels and stuff. But the sound couldn't be on, except for like when the soccer games are going on, we'd turn the sound on for them, because only the inmates with money that they could, people on the outside of the prison could put money on their books, and then they could buy things from the commissary like chips, and honey buns were the most popular thing, and they could buy cheese sauces and coffee. And that's about it. But they could also buy radios that you could just listen to the radio with, obviously, or you could tune it into the TV. So if you didn't have a radio, you couldn't listen to the TV, but you could watch it. So during the big soccer games, we would turn on the sound for them just to be nice so everyone could hear it, what was going on. But so we have to do the cell searches, and you would just go through their stuff and check their pillows, check the wall, check the bunks inside of them, run your fingers over everything, and just search all their stuff. And yeah, I think they had lockers inside of there, and so you have to open up all the lockers. None of them like actually locked. And the biggest thing that you would find that they weren't allowed to have is porn. Either someone would somehow send them in the mail and hide it, of just cut out magazines, or it would be pictures of their own wives and girlfriends and stuff. And they're not allowed to have that. And one time we were searching a cell, and I don't know how it went on for so long, because these cell searches are just random. And like I said, there's 10 cells and 8 different day rooms, so there's 80 cells. So one person's cell could literally go months without being searched. But I went and searched this guy's cell, and literally he was on the bottom bunk, and the entire top part of the bottom part of the top bunk was plastered with por- porno- pornographic pictures. And I remember it because I was working with this officer that was my good friend. I won't use his real name just for anonymity, but we'll call him Charlie. So I was working with Charlie, and we were searching the cell, and then he goes and looks up, and he sees these pornographic pictures, but not a big deal. We would just take them and confiscate them and throw them away. But he just starts dying laughing. Like, he gets down on his hands and knees. He's laughing so hard. And he's like, Miller. He's like, Miller, come over here. Look at this. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, oh, it's pornographic pictures. And he's like, look at that one. He's like, it's midget porn. And that was so funny to him for some reason. He laughed about it forever. And me and Charlie worked together a lot, so we got to know each other. But that was so funny. But if an inmate would go and piss you off for any reason, the best way to get back at them would be to go flip their cell, which is an entirely different thing from searching it. You would either flip the entire cell or you would just flip their bunk. And what I mean by flipping the cell or flipping the bunk would mean you take all the sheets off the pillow and the bed, and you take their container and their locker and you flip it. You throw it all on the floor, you spread it out everywhere. And if they pissed you off real good, you did the whole cell, because then all of their friends would be mad too. Or sometimes they're not friends, they're just their bunk mates, their cellmates. They would get mad at them too, and they wouldn't do that, whatever that thing is they did again. It could be something as easy as like, of course, when, like I said, it was a medium low facility. So the inmates had a pretty good amount of free movement, but it was only during certain times that they were allowed to just walk around the facility. And there was obviously still parts of the facility you're not allowed to just walk into. Like the cafeteria was only open during breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You couldn't just go hang out in the cafeteria. And then the rec yards would open up after breakfast. And then if you went into the rec yard after breakfast, there was a free movement time, so you could go in there and hang out for a little bit and then go back to your cell, or you could go there, and after a certain amount of time, the gate would close, and you couldn't move freely anymore from there. And then the cafeteria would close, and you couldn't go there anymore. But during the times of movement, we would have to search inmates randomly, just like the flipping or searching their cells randomly. So, an inmate's walking by you, and you say, hey, inmate Rojas, get over here, I'm going to search you. And he acts like he didn't hear you at all. And then you say it again, and then maybe you say it in Spanish, in case he doesn't speak English, because, like I said, they're legal immigrants. They're from Mexico and wherever. Most of them are bilingual, but some of them don't speak any English at all. And so then you say it in Spanish. He still doesn't stop. So now I have to go chase him down, get in front of him, because I'm not allowed to touch him unless I'm searching him. So I can't like grab him on the shoulder and say, hey, dude, I'm talking to you. That's technically assault. So unless an inmate assaults me, then I can't assault him. But so then he pissed me off. You didn't listen to me. I search him. You're not going to find things most of the time. And then I take his ID and I remember it. And I ask him where he lives. That's what we'd say. We'd say, where do you live? And that just means, which building are you from? Which day room? So like I said, you have Echo building, and then the day rooms are labeled Echo, Alpha, Bravo, etc. And so he might say, "Oh, I live in Echo Bravo 8." That means he lives in Echo Building, Bravo Day Room, Cell 8. All right. And so then later on, while he's at the rec time, or maybe he's eating lunch or dinner, I'll go into his cell and I'll flip his cell for not listening to me, or maybe just his bunk, not the whole cell, depending on the severity of the offense that he did towards me. So that's one of the things. Or the biggest time that you would find contraband on inmates is during chow time, which is breakfast, lunch, dinner. Call it just chow time. There would be 2 to 3, sometimes 4 or 5 officers that stood outside, just depending on how well staffed we were. They would stand directly outside of the cafeteria, which is only a one-way in, one-way out. And we would randomly search inmates. And depending on the day and what was being served would also depend on how many officers were there searching. Because if it was good food, we would have more officers searching, because a lot of them would try to smuggle the food out back to their cells, which they're not allowed to do. And especially if it was a day where they were serving oranges, because oranges were the most common thing used to make prison wine, or hooch, as they would call it. So, say I'm one of the officers that either got assigned to be searching inmates as they come out, or I just volunteered to do it. And I'm searching an inmate, and I find out he has 5 oranges. They'd either put them in their waistband, because none of their uniform would have pockets except for the front pocket where they would put their ID that they had to have on them at all times. If they didn't have their ID on them, that was a big offense that you could almost get sent to the SHU for, depending on the day and how the sergeant was feeling. So, say I search him and I find 5 oranges on him. Well, then I take his ID, I ask him where he lives, and later I would have to go search his cell to make sure he wasn't making hooch, and make sure that he didn't have more oranges. So that's one of the things I would also search his cell for. And then you document that in the logbook. You say what time you did it, who it was that you searched, or if it was the entire cell you searched, blah, blah, blah. So that was the second biggest thing that we would find as contraband, was hooch. And the thing is, though, they would make this stuff, but by the time it got ripe, if you've ever smelled moonshine, that's basically what it was. And you'd be able to smell it. So you most of the time could almost narrow it down to which cell it was in just by the smell. And so sometimes we'd find hooch. And this one time, I don't know how it went on for so long, but I ended up finding 3 full trash bags. And I'm talking 50-gallon trash bags full of hooch. And it smelled disgusting. I don't know how these guys drank that stuff. It was disgusting. So another thing that we would normally find is shrines to Santa Muerte, which is the patron saint of death. These guys would worship him, and they're not allowed to have that because it's not technically a part of any religion. It's a cartel thing. So you find that and you just confiscate it and throw it away. They're not allowed to do it. They would make shrines of these things either inside their bunks or inside their lockers, and they're not allowed to have that. And they would worship to it and they would pray to it, and just a bad thing. um, which the only other thing inmates are allowed to carry on them besides their ID was a rosary. If they were Catholic, they could carry a rosary with them. But another another big thing that we would have is tattoos. And I would tell inmates, like, if you see a fresh tattoo, you're supposed to immediately detain that inmate and you're supposed to take him to medical so it can be documented. And then that goes under self mutilation, even though it's, not technically like slitting your wrist or things like that. Um, it would go under self mutilation, and you would usually get sent to the SHU for that for probably a week or two. But I would tell these inmates, like, if I saw a fresh tattoo, I wasn't the type of person to haul them off to medical and send them to SHU. But if I catch you in the act of giving a tattoo, I have to say something and confiscate your tattoo gun. So I would find tattoo guns a lot, and I would always confiscate them because if I find contraband, I'm firm and I'm consistent. I'm going to take it, no matter what it is. If I agree with it, if I don't, it's my job. It's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take a short bathroom break. You guys won't notice it, but just in case, so I'm going to pause this. All right, guys, I'm back. For you, that's not going to be much time, but so what I'm trying to do here is give you enough pertinent information and building up to when the riot happened so that I don't have to explain as much as I talk about the riot as it happens. And I also just wanted to give you guys some insight as to my time as a correctional officer. But so we were talking about contraband. So the biggest thing was cell phones. So in the punishment, in the ranking of punishment that you could give an inmate once, from inside the prison, the highest thing that, or I guess you could say the worst thing an inmate could do was kill someone. Obviously, murder is the worst thing that you could do. But the second worst thing you could do was have a cell phone. And the reason for that is it's a security breach. And the problem with that is they could make phone calls and they could have communication with people that was not monitored. So inside the prison, every form of communication is monitored. If they call someone through the prison phone, it's recorded. When they mail letters out, they're not even allowed to seal the envelopes because the officers have to read them first and then seal them, and they send them out. And when they get letters in, they have to open them and check to see what's inside and read them and see what was said, and then they can have them. And the craziest thing I heard about was one time this inmate tried to send vials of his own baby gravy to his wife so she could get pregnant while he was in prison. Because at this prison, they weren't allowed to have conjugal visits. They're allowed to have regular visitations on Saturday and Sundays and on holidays. So he tried to do that, and it didn't work because they found it. But so the next biggest thing was cell phones. And if you found a cell phone, you went to the SHU for a good 2 to 3 months, and you also got time added onto your sentence. I think like a month or two. It was a big no-no, and they did that to try to, um, keep it from happening. You're gonna get time added onto your sentence, and you're gonna go to the shoe in solitary confinement for a good while. Which I don't know how I feel about solitary confinement. It kind of seems like a cruel and unusual punishment for long periods of time. But then at the same time, it's like, how are you supposed to punish them inside prison? So I don't know. I might have to talk about that some other time. But so I came up with this amazing idea one time, um, to find cell phones. And this is where I made a lot of inmates mad because inmates would pay around $3,000 to get a cell phone inside the facility. And it happened. They would either pay officers to do it, and one time they found out this officer was smuggling in cell phones through his boots. What he had done was he hollowed out the sole of his boots and he could put cell phones in there. So they would pay about $3,000 for like a cheap flip phone that would probably cost you on the outside $80 or $100, however much those things are. But what they're paying for is to have it smuggled in, because if you get caught bringing a cell phone in, you also can get 3 to 4 months in jail. So I was offered multiple times to bring stuff in. I would always say no because I'm just not done. I'm not going to jail. I'm not. There was nothing, no amount of money you could pay me to do that. But some officers, I guess they wanted some extra money and they thought that they could just do it once. But the thing is, once you do it once, now you're caught. And you will have to do almost anything for that inmate at that point because he has blackmail on you. Because all he has to do is get rid of his evidence. And if you make him mad or you don't do something that he says, he'll know when you're bringing a cell phone in or tobacco or drugs, whatever it is. And then he'll just go tell on you. And he won't get in any trouble because he doesn't have it on him anymore. And he'll just say, oh, I heard Officer blah, blah, blah was bringing this in. And then you'll get caught. And there won't be any proof that you ever brought it in specifically to him. So this officer got caught because he was a maintenance officer. So he would go up on the roof with these inmates. Very special inmates got to go up on the roof. They had to be very trusted orderlies to be able to do that. But he would go up on the roof to work on the AC or do this or that. And then there'd be absolutely no cameras to show him doing that. So that's how he did it for a long time. And eventually he got caught and he went to jail. Or sometimes what they would do is they would have people come up to the fence and throw packages over the fence. And the way that we combated that is we always had 2 officers on the outside in vehicles, and they would just drive circles for 8 hours straight. Not 8 hours straight. They would take a 30-minute break, but an 8-hour shift, just driving circles around the outside of the prison at like 5 or 10 miles an hour. And that not only helped to try and stop people from throwing packages over the fence, but to also catch people escaping if that happened, which never happened while I was there. But that prison wasn't always owned by Geo, so previously it had 3 inmates escaped from it, but not under Geo's time owning it. And this prison is no longer operated by Geo as far as I know. Um, about 2 years after I quit, it got shut down. But um, so that was the way they'd get cell phones in different other ways, the prison wallet and stuff like that. But so I figured out this way to catch them with cell phones. So, like I said, when you walk into the Echo or Delta facility, there's 8 day rooms and they're connected by doors on the bottom floor and the top row. And the way it was set up, there was only a stairs to go up to the top on one side of the top row. So cell number 10 was always in the corner by the wall. And every time that an officer came into a day room, they would whoop whoop, whistle, or oh, it's the police, or officer, or whatever, policia. They would yell that so everyone would know an officer is in the day room, because not an officer isn't always in the day room. So the way I figured out how to find them with cell phones, and it worked for a good while, was I would go into, let's say, the alpha day room, and I would just go do walking around. They would do their whoop whoops, and I would just go say hi to people and talk with them, ask them how their card games are going, or what's on TV, what's going on. I would go into cells and just look around, maybe not search them, but just look around. Then I'd go to the top and look around, but then I would walk up to that door that connects to the other day room, and I would put my keys in there and slowly turn it so it doesn't make any sound, and then rip that door open and immediately head into cell 10. I caught 3 people using cell phones doing that method. And of course, eventually they caught on, so it became harder to find, but you rarely would find cell phones even if you flipped an entire cell. Um, so that was a way I was able to find cell phones. And um, most of the time, like I said, they're flip phones. But one time I found a smartphone, and inmates pay a good amount of money. I told you it's $3,000 for a flip phone that probably costs $80 or $100. Now you're talking about a smart, like I never found an iPhone, but I found Androids, cheaper ones, that probably cost a good $800. And they pay around $10,000 to get those things in there because they're bigger. So whenever you found one of those, you really make someone mad. And so the first thing I'd have to do is I would tell the inmate to put it down, and then I would search him thoroughly, and I would immediately call over the radio that I found a cell phone, and a sergeant and or a lieutenant would immediately come there. They would come running because this is a big thing, and we would lock down that entire day room, sometimes the entire building, um, the entire Echo building, and we would search everyone's cells. But you rarely found them just searching because they hit them well, obviously, because they're not supposed to have them. One time I found it buried in a pillow, so I had to then realize that like you have to take the pillow and scrunch it up and feel all over it for anything hard. Um, but then they would take that inmate and send him to the SHU and do all that paperwork. Um, but that's about it as far as the things I would catch. You would catch them making hooch. You would catch them making weapons sometimes. I only found one, and I only heard of like 3 or 4 other incidents where we found weapons being made. Um, and I think it was like 2 months in to my time at the prison when I saw my first fight, and it was during count time. So if you've not worked in the correctional, that line of work before, we have to do counts every so many hours. I think right before breakfast at 7 a.m. there would be a count, and then after, I think, yeah, around 2 p.m. before the next shift comes, there would be a count. And then at 10 p.m., right before the next shift comes in, there'd be a count. But overnight, there's not a lot to do. So mostly all you do is rounds and count. And that literally means you count the inmates. And so the way we would do that is two officers would go into the day room, and most of the time you had 2 teams of 2 people for each building, for each Alpha, Bravo, and they would go in there, and like one person would take A through D, and the other person would take E through F and whatever. And so you would go in there, and one person would stand against the wall, and they were called the observer. And the other person, during count time, the entire prison's locked down, so every cell is locked and closed. So usually, the person in central control would just be watching what's going on too, and they would see you walking up to a cell. They'd buzz it open, so you don't have to call and use up radio space, because it's supposed to be dead air during that time too. And I would, so I'm the counter. I would go in there. I'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, and I'd write it down on a piece of paper. Close that cell, lock it, go to the next one. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do that for all 10 cells. Then I would go against the wall and be the watcher, and the next guy would go in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then we would come back and we'd compare numbers. And if we didn't have the same number for some reason, we'd have to do it all over again until we got the same number. Most of the time, you got the same number. And then you would call in, and you would, to the central control, you'd say, Central Control, this is Officer Miller, Echo Alpha 78. And they would either say clear or that's not right. And if that's not right, you have to do it again and make sure you have the right number until they say clear. Then you move on to Echo Bravo, Echo Charlie, Echo Delta, blah, 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 until every single inmate was literally accounted for. And so about 2 months in, I see my first fight. I'm the observer, and I'm working with, let's call him Brandon. I'm working with Brandon on the team, and he's on the top row, and he's counting, and then the cell door opens, and he just goes, "What the F? What the F?" And I'm like, what's going on? And I'm not allowed to leave my position until it's my turn to count. And then the next thing I know, he comes over the radio and he calls a code yellow, which a code yellow is inmate on inmate assault. Well, I'm not allowed to leave this position, so I just get to see him standing up there, and eventually he just closes the door and locks it again. And what was happening was 2 inmates were fighting. They were both bigger guys. And supposedly, someone stole someone else's honey buns. Or someone lost one or ate one that they didn't remember. So he kept telling the guy to confess and give him back his honey bun or pay him back for it, whatever. And he kept saying, "No, I didn't steal your honey bun. I didn't take your honey bun. I didn't eat it." And it led to a fight. And it wasn't too bad, but they ended up both having to go to the SHU. And the second fight that I saw Um, I actually didn't see it, but it just it happened right before lockdown at the end of the night. So I think around, yeah, it would be that 10 p.m. count. That's when lockdown would be, and until after the 6 a.m. count or the 7 a.m. count, um, that's when the prison would open back up again. So from 10 to 7 a.m., it's completely locked down. And that's when the inmates are supposed to be asleep. But I mean, they obviously don't have to go to sleep. Sometimes when I would work the overnight shift that I did a couple of times, you would just go into inmate cells at like 3 a.m. for count, and they'd just be up playing cards. Whatever. You're allowed to do that. Um, no complaints from me, obviously. But it was right before that 10 p.m. count. And I guess one of these inmates had a debt to pay and he couldn't pay it. So, right before count, the central control is supposed to go up, and there's big windows that you can see into each day room. And they're supposed to just basically walk circles around and make sure all the inmates are going to lockdown for count. And there's a speaker that you can use, and you can talk to them if you need to, if they're not going in. But I guess somehow this officer completely missed it. We're able to watch the cameras later, but 6 guys just literally jumped this guy and beat him unconscious. So the next time that the officer came by to look in that day room, dude was just laying on the ground unconscious. So that delayed count, which is a big thing. If count gets delayed, it's not a good thing. And they had to take him to medical, obviously, and they found all the inmates that did it because there's cameras everywhere in the prison. And then the last fight that I saw or didn't really see happen, but was the riot. So I guess we're going to lead into that now. So I want to make sure I have my dates right. So on July 9th, 2017, I came into work and I was working the evening shift, and I had just come back from my lunch break, but dinner break, because it was the evening shift. And it was around 8 p.m. I get back into Echo building, and I'm working with Charlie from earlier. And we're both um, just sitting in the office, and count's supposed to happen at 10. So this is about the time that like everything's winding down. The inmates have already eaten dinner, and we're supposed to just be chilling and waiting for the next shift to come in at 11 after count. And then it's about 8 to 9 p.m. And that day we were holding a basically an Olympics type event. So like I said earlier, there's only supposed to be about 400 to 500 inmates on each rec yard at a time. We don't really count them, but that's just about how many are supposed to be on the rec yard at one time. But that day, there was 1,200 inmates on the Echo Charlie yard for this Olympic event. Because like I said, it's the bigger rec yard, and it has basketball courts and soccer courts and weightlifting and a track. So they were doing this Olympic type thing. Well, there was 3 officers on that yard, and one of the officers was on the very southwest side, and the other 2 officers happened to be on the northeast side. that's where the gate is that leads to the Echo Delta and the main facility. So this Olympic thing's going on, and I guess some gang tensions got heated, and there was a dispute over who won this event. And eventually it broke out into a fight. And the fight broke out into a bigger fight because there was 1,200 inmates on this yard. And even as big as this yard was, it was still it was very packed. And so I'm just chilling in my Echo building, and come over the radio is a code yellow. And then shortly after is a code black, which is an assault on an officer. So we're not supposed to do this. Okay, I remember at the time it was me, Charlie, and a female officer. And so me and Charlie hear the code black, and we immediately take off running to the Echo Delta yard. And by the time we get there, it was me and probably 10 to 12 other officers. One of the sergeants, who was my good friend, we'll call him Sergeant Dan. Probably should have saved that for a lieutenant, but Sergeant Dan was there. And then Lieutenant, we'll call him Lieutenant Julio because he was a Mexican. So just to keep that consistent. So that, and then probably 10 other officers showed up to this code black call. So there was about 13 of us total. And like I said, there was 2 officers closer to the gate, and 1 officer was way off in the northwest end of this rec yard. And so that fight starts, and then a bigger fight starts, and the next thing you know, it's an entire brawl. And we realize pretty quickly that this is not good. So then all the inmates start trying to pour out of the Echo Delta yard. And this is when big fights start happening between the inmates and the officers that responded. I, luckily, did not get in the middle of all that. I did not get hit or anything. But I remember immediately being like, oh, shit. and Sergeant Dan was on the ground and had 3 inmates attacking him. So I immediately got over there and started pushing these inmates off of him, and I helped him up. And then Lieutenant Julio just started yelling, everyone, get this gate secured. So we somehow got the inmates pushed back into the Echo Delta yard. And then it took a long time, but every single one of us was able to pull that gate closed and get it latched. And then he said, everyone run to the facility, to the main facility. So we all run straight to the facility. And by that time, 1,200 people pushing on a gate. They broke it open. I remember looking back at one point and seeing just an amalgamation of inmates heading my way. And I was probably the 3rd or 4th person to get inside the facility. And then after every single officer got inside the facility, we were able to shut that door, and we got it shut well before they were able to get to that door. So at that point, the riot is on about 9 p.m. on July 9th. And the first thing that we do is we all go to central control. We pick up handcuffs. We pick up pepper spray. And then we pick up the paintball guns with the pepper balls. And then I headed over with Sergeant, we'll call him Sergeant James. and a couple other officers. And we all, at that point, all the officers were on high alert, obviously. We locked down the entire facility, put every inmate in their cell. The inmates didn't know what was going on at first, obviously. And me and Sergeant James and a couple other officers, we headed immediately to the Alpha building. And from the top of the Alpha building, you could see directly over into that hallway, but it was made with gates, like I said, not an actual hallway. There's no roof on it. It's made with fences and stuff. And you can see directly over into the Echo Delta yard. And man, was it a sight. I'm going to try to pull up an image. Okay. Dang it, I was gonna. So we ran to the roof of Alpha building. Can I make this bigger? Sorry, guys, I should have prepared for this. Maybe I can just save it. So we were on the roof of Alpha building and we're watching all this go down. The inmates are just tearing stuff apart. So here's a picture of the full facility. So as you can see, this is the main building. This is Bravo, Delta, Echo. And this is the rec yard. And this is, oh, so there's a baseball field. I forgot about that on Alpha. And this is, oh no, so we ran to Charlie. I'm so sorry. We ran to the Charlie. This is Charlie, Bravo, Alpha, main facility, parking lot. Rear gate, that's where checking in happens in the officer's break room. So we're here, and this is where the gate is. And this is where, then we ran to here, and we went to central control, and then we went to Charlie building, and we're up here. And we can see all these inmates just tearing stuff apart. And when a code yellow or a code black happens, medical has to respond immediately. So they were out there with a stretcher and medical stuff, you know, a bag of gauze and tourniquets and stuff like that. And so I'm up here on the building with Sergeant James and a couple other inmates. The sun's setting over over the Echo Delta yard, and they're tearing apart the soccer goals, and the medical team didn't get the stretcher out, so there were inmates like surfing on it, going up and down between the buildings. And then so you can kind of see right there, one of the vehicles that patrols the outside, he had stopped there per protocol. That's like what he's supposed to do. He had stopped there to make sure no one was going to climb these fences. And the guys on the outside, they're armed. They have shotguns and they have pistols. So they're tearing apart this soccer goal. There's multiple like light poles throughout here with cameras on them. And they're climbing those things. They're throwing rocks at the cameras, destroying them. And by now, almost every single inmate over here, and of course there were inmates on the Alpha Bravo yard too at the time, but every inmate that's in this area, they have taken their shirts off and they've ripped them apart and they've fashioned face coverings. And they're destroying all the light poles and the lights and the cameras that are all around here. And they're destroying the soccer goals. And then some of the guys that are closer, we're taking pop shots at them with the pepper balls. If we're seeing them destroy stuff, we're not just shooting people to shoot them. But if they're destroying stuff, they got shot. And they take the soccer goal and they finally get it torn apart. And they take it through this gate and they lean it up against here. And a couple of inmates climb up there, and then they're trying to pull that soccer goal piece up there to lean it up against there and get on the roof. Well, the guy that was sitting over here armed, he shoots at them with the shotgun 2 times. They got down and they never got back up. He didn't hit anyone with them, but obviously, like the shotguns didn't have slugs. It was probably birdshot or may have been buckshot, but that's a good distance to be shooting with a shotgun. If he shot him at him with a pistol, he might have hit someone, but he didn't hit anyone. Sorry, I had to pause that or mute for a second, but so we're up here and we're just watching it unfold. At this point, there's nothing we can do. And at that point, it's just mass hysteria. And eventually, so the officers that were in here and the officers that were in here, we all vacated. And technically, we weren't supposed to do that because you're not supposed to leave the building unattended, even though, so there's a person that works the central control in both these buildings. And they are the only 2 officers left. And then the guy that was all the way over here, he got stuck in all of it. But it was about 2 hours in, the inmates gave up. Technically, they're only hostage. But the 2 guys that were stuck in the central controls here, they got stuck in there until we took the yard, until we took the facility back. And they were able to get up on the roof sometimes, or they may have spent time in there. I don't really remember talking to them much because both of them quit after, pretty quickly after. And so eventually they broke the doors open. Well, the doors may have been left open. And they got inside the facility. They broke all the doors open into the day rooms. And they got all the fire extinguishers out. And they sprayed them everywhere. Literally, when we walked back through them for the first time, there was like an inch or 2 of fire extinguisher dust all over the floors. But so back to the timeline. It's about 10 p.m. now, and it's getting dark. And every police officer that could responded. And they all came out, and there was probably no more than 2 feet between each police car all around the outside of this. And they all had their cherries and berries on. So by that time, all these officers responded. But before we could take the facility back, we had to wait for another facility to respond. And that was, hold on, Big Springs Correctional Facility in Texas. They were able to respond. And that was probably, I mean, at first it was fairly controlled because we were able to get that door shut. If we weren't able to get that door shut to the main facility, this would have been bad. But they weren't able to respond until about 6 hours later, about 4 to 5 a.m. in the morning. I don't know why I said in the morning, that was redundant, but they finally came and helped us. But leading up to that, so immediately I ran to the Charlie building. And as you can see, like I explained earlier, it's differently shaped than the other two or the other four. They're more like, they obviously don't look circular here, but they're more circular on the inside. And this one's a rectangle. But we were up here on this roof and we're watching it all unfold. We're taking pop shots at people who are destroying stuff, people who are climbing fences and stuff like that. And about 11 p.m. to 12 a.m., we had been able to do a count of everyone that was inside the facility. The facility was completely locked down. And by that time, every inmate that wanted to be a part of the riot was in this area, in the Echo Delta buildings and yard, tearing stuff up and starting fires and stuff like that. Anyone that didn't want to be a part of the riot was over here. So eventually it got to the point where it was kind of calmed down and we were just waiting for the other people to respond. And I was able at one point to go to the on top of Bravo building to look out at stuff. And then I was able to go up to Alpha, and there were certain times when I was able to take breaks, bathroom breaks and stuff, but I wasn't allowed to leave the facility. And like I said, I worked the evening shift, so I was already overdue time to be off. And at one point, I was up on Alpha building, and I can't remember the officer I was with, but we were just up there and we were just kind of watching these guys over here. They weren't doing much. They were just sitting down. They didn't have face coverings. But then I'm just chilling up there. I notice inmates starting to sneak off this way, and there's a fence right here. So they shouldn't be able to get around this area. And eventually I run over to this side and I can see there's a group of inmates now, and they're trying to, it's hard to see, it might be harder for you guys to see, but there's a fence right here where my mouse cursor is, and they are trying to break this fence down to get to the rear gate. And eventually they break through it, and obviously there's supposed to be dead silence on the radio at this time, but I came over the radio and said there are inmates trying to break the rear gate because they had gotten through that fence and now they're trying to break down the rear gate. I don't know what their plan was, because if they would have broke fully through the rear gate, like I said, there was cops surrounding this entire facility. So if they would have broke, so I'm going to bring up another image. So like you can see, like there was not much space between these cop cars. And if they would have broke through that gate, they would have been met with lethal force. Because if you don't know, if there is an escaped inmate, you're allowed to use lethal force on them just because they're an escaped inmate. So don't know what their plan was, but I called it in and I popped a couple of them with pepper balls, and some of them started running back after I did that. And then I'm standing right about here, and that's where the door to this processing part in break room is. And luckily, they never got into the break room and broke anything in there. But I'm just sitting there, and then I hear someone call this door, which I don't remember the name of that door, but they call for that door. And then I'm about to pick up my radio and say, hey, you guys don't need to be going to the break room right now. There's tons of inmates out here. Well, then the door pops open. I hear tink, tink, and a flashbang goes off right in front of my face. Only time I've seen a flashbang go off until later that night, but it was the first time I'd ever seen one go off, and it was right in front of my face. And so then they start, they're stacked up. It was very military-esque, and they push them back over here, and they made a makeshift thing to close that up. And so there was no more inmates that could get through here. And as they were running around this way, I was able to pop one of them with a pepper ball, and he fell flat on his face and then scurried back up. And they got out. And then we had no more problems in this area. It all was contained into here at that point, basically. So then it was around 4 to 5 a.m. when those other guys showed up. And we came out through here, and we started pushing the inmates back this way. And then eventually we were able to have them all pretty much inside this rec yard. And then it was basically a full-on clash. We were in full riot gear, the face shields, and everything. And they had, at that time, they were unloading the people from here. And there's a gym. I forgot there's a gym connected to the Alpha building right here. And they were putting people in there that were from this yard. And they were putting them in there. And we basically, everyone got a gas mask, but we ran short about 20 gas masks. Every officer and every administrative person, everyone that worked at this building had showed up by then. And then all the other people from the other facility had showed up. So I want to say there was there's only 300 to 400 officers still to about the probably 12 to 1,300 inmates that were on this riot. So that's still a good 2 to 3 to 1 officer. And so we set up CS foggers along here and along there. And then we had, like gas grenades, and we had flashbangs. And we had pushed them back into here. And then we just started it. And then we threw flashbangs, we threw the gas grenades, we set the foggers off. I didn't have a gas mask. I luckily found out that day that I'm part of the 1 to 2% of the population that CS gas doesn't really affect me that much. Like, it irritated my eyes a lot, but I was still able to be a functional person. And so what happened when the showdown started? The inmates pushed forward what you would call them as peons, the lower enlisted, whatever you want to call them, inmates that were, they pushed them forward first to clash with the officers. And so they were running at us as we threw the flashbangs and the CS grenades. And what happened was one of the inmates happened to run directly over a flashbang as it went off, and it blew his junk off. And I still remember that to this day. This dude was wailing so loud, and they hauled him off, and we just started clashing. We started taking these guys and putting them in quick cuffs, which are basically just zip ties. And taking them off into that. And eventually we had like every inmate that was either involved in the riot over here or was over here. We had them in that gym. And about 9 a.m. it was over. And we had every inmate counted and accounted for. And it wasn't until about 11 or 12 I was finally relieved from duty. And I remember my lieutenant, um, it was a woman, and we'll call her Brittany, Lieutenant Brittany. She told me, "You're relieved from duty, Officer Miller. Go to the visitation room, which is in this area, and there's pizza in there." And so I went in there and I ate for the first time, because, like I said, I just got back from my dinner. But the thing is, this facility is in the middle of, like, not the middle of nowhere. It's about 3 miles south of a town. And since I was working the late shift, um, the evening shift, there wasn't much open, so I had to drive. It basically took my entire 30-minute break to drive over to a gas station, get some food, and drive back. So then I had to come back in, and I had just gotten sat down and with my food, and I didn't even get to eat it. So it had been a good, over 12, like 13 or 14 hours since I ate. So I sat down and I ate almost a whole pizza, and I drank a couple drinks, and then I came and I clocked out, and then I um, sat down in my car, and the adrenaline rush was over, and I finally got my phone because we're not allowed to have phones in there, like I said. And it was completely blown up with everyone checking on me and wanting to see how I was. And uh, I finally got to go home, and like it all hit me at once. And they told us, everyone, as they were relieved, they said, "Don't come back for 24 hours." And then after that, it was 12-hour shifts for a while until we got everything cleaned up. And like I said, when we first got back in there, there was just that fire hydrant dust everywhere. And so here's a couple pictures. Like, this is what the rec yard looked like afterwards. These are just all the inmates' beds and their crap, just all over. I'm sorry these pictures aren't better. They look better like this, but for you to actually see them, that's what it looked like afterwards. That's about the best. But I think there's like a video here I might be able to show. So yeah, so you can see here just like what it looked like when we were done. I don't know why there's not any audio on this, but I remember that helicopter flying around when I was leaving. Yeah, there was inmates just sleeping out there. And they told me after, um, when they went to clean up the yard for the first time, they literally picked up 3 5-gallon buckets full of cell phones that just got left out there. And like those coolers there, they were full of Pepsis. I don't know why they were only allowed to get Pepsi, like not Mountain Dew, not Coke or Fanta. But see, like as you can see in the Alpha Bravo yard, um, not much got destroyed over there, and that's the rear gate. As you can see, it's a Sally Port. I wonder who those two officers are. But That's where they were when they were trying to destroy it. Let's see if it shows the destroyed part of it. It's right there. Maybe it didn't really get destroyed. I think there are like actual gates there you can open, but they're chained and everything. They might have got those open. But yeah. We went to clean up, so in the long hallway that leads up in there, there's like ice makers. And what I did, yeah, so you can see all that stuff, man. They tore it all up. What I did is I would go get the Pepsis and stuff that the inmates left out there, and I put them inside those ice chests. And so whenever we wanted one, we just pull it out of that ice chest, that ice maker. Um, but I mean, they destroyed the power in there, so eventually all the ice melted. It was a good week before they got all the power restored to the Echo and Delta building. Uh, but we had to clean all that stuff up ourselves. But the cool thing was they let us come through the rear gate and drive trucks around into this yard to pick all this stuff up instead of taking it through. And so whoever the officer was that got chosen to do that, he would go to all of our cars. We'd give him the keys to our cars, and they would get our cigarettes or our dip and our cell phones out, so that while we were cleaning up these yards, we could use it and play on our phones and stuff. Because we only did it at night. I don't know why. I guess because it was summer. This was like, this is getting towards the middle of summer where it's very hot here in Oklahoma. But it was a fun experience, I'll tell you. It was the funnest day I ever had at work. Yeah, those are like the chairs that the inmates had um, provided to them by the prison. And those are their beds. They're not very nice. Oh, officer's leaving. Hope that wasn't me. I've never watched this video before, actually. That could be me. That almost looks like me. I am not joking. It's hard to tell in this video, but that's about the way I walk, so that could be me. It could be, yeah, because I remember. So, yeah. Um, if you guys made it this far, this was a longer episode than I thought it was going to be. Almost 2 hours, it's the longest solo episode I've ever done. But if you made it this far, thank you guys. And don't forget to go check out Chris's channel and check out his newest, I think it'll be his newest podcast when this goes up. At JBU_show and at militia_project on X. Just Between Us on Spotify and Rumble. I believe he's on just about anywhere you can find podcasts. You'll find him, Just Between Us show, and anchor.fm/JBU. And go check out that recent episode. It was a good one. I haven't listened to it yet. It was released today as of recording this. But yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.